Alright, so now that we have covered guides, we're going to look at cloning options when you're scoped into a painting or sculpture versus scoped out. And this relates strongly to the thermometer, so I'm going to turn on the thermometer. Even though I'm going to do such small samples here that we're not going to start seeing really big differences, it'll just be a frame of reference. So I'm going to start with Sculpt, and we have that floor there, but we don't really need it. So I'm going to use the stamp tool, because I'm going to use it to also show the examples of how you can use soft blend in when you clone something scoped in, but not when you're scoped out. So I'm going to change the blend amount, and I covered this on a previous tutorial. And I'll just start making a couple, just a really simple little weird shape here that has some blending on it. So there's 3 shapes here. This is scoped in to the sculpture. Now when I scope out, looking at the whole sculpture is now one shape. That is one thing in the level as it relates to the gameplay thermometer. Also, the different thermometers were covered in a previous tutorial. If I take this now and I clone it and make a few copies, sort of stretch it out, move it around, you can see that the soft blend is not applying here because these are separate objects, and the soft blend only applies when you're inside of the individual sculpture itself. Doing this is very good for the graphics thermometer because these are a bunch of individual simple shapes. Eventually, it's not so good for the gameplay thermometer because every one of these shapes is one thing. So I'm going to remove some of those. I'm going to scope back in here. And originally, this little cluster here, this is 3 separate stamps of one. Rather than cloning the group over and over again, I'm going to clone just this one cube shape and keep making a more complex thing in here. And you can see the soft blend is still applying to it, even though I'm not stamping the shape anymore, I'm just cloning it. And you could do this with any shape to stamp it or clone it. You can turn on the kaleidoscope from here and it will affect whatever was the center point will be the first one that was stamped down, but the kaleidoscope only affects things that you stamp after now. So cloning on the kaleidoscope doesn't work if the kaleidoscope was turned off when you started cloning. But if I were to go back to my stamp tool now and start stamping, it remembers where the first shape was in the structure, and now if I stamp, drop the tool, and start cloning, I'm still on the kaleidoscope. Also, you cannot do multiple selections. You can only select one stamp, or if you're on the smear tool, it's whatever the whole gesture was, but you can only select one at a time. So that can make it a little bit more challenging here because you can't take this whole arrangement and clone it over and over again. But now if we scope back out, this is all still one shape. The more complex this one sculpture gets, the more the graphics thermometer will start to go up. See, now it's at 11% already just from making all of those extra shapes. If I back up a whole bunch until it was back down. Oops. So those original just few lumps were 4%. If I take this cluster of 3 and I start making a whole bunch of clones of this one group, because they're still all instances of the same original object, the graphics thermometer isn't changing. And right now the gameplay thermometer isn't changing yet. It will eventually once you build a whole level out of a whole lot of little shapes. This can actually start to fill up. So you have to kind of find a balance because you don't want to fill up your graphics thermometer with just a few incredibly complex sculptures. But once you've made those complex sculptures and you clone them out, the graphics thermometer doesn't increase as long as those are direct duplicates. So it's a balance to find between the graphics and the gameplay thermometers. it's a really good way of making a level quickly to use the cloning effect, and especially as Johnny keeps showing us, and Kareem also, if you have something you can use from multiple angles. So this isn't really a particularly useful shape, but it is interesting from different sides, and so as long as you can take it and you can clone it and move it around and you can change the scale and everything. You can also, now I've got, 2 duplicates of this, change the scale, doesn't affect the graphics thermometer. If you go into the tweak menu and you start adding tints, or you do that through the coat mode, excuse me, I can tint just one, and I could add things like a glow to it. That's not actually going to change the fact that it still is a duplicate of the other one. What starts to really change it, I'll just undo those really quick. If I go scope in to one of these, and I'll turn off actually I'll leave the kaleidoscope on so that I can just really make a dramatic change to one shape and not the other. Now this shape is unique from the other one, and we're no longer saving on the graphics thermometer. If we go back and we make a live clone, which is in the tools here, check live cloning, and now if we scope in, it's doing the same thing to both. So that's better for the graphics thermometer in a way, but it's also still making a more complex shape. But it still is better to have duplicates, several duplicates of a complex shape, than to have a whole lot of unique shapes, even if those unique shapes are simple. It's also important that there's no live cloning option when you're scoped into the sculpture. You can still clone, and that's the same as the shortcut of pressing L1 and X, or sorry, not X, pressing L1 and R2 to select something is the same thing as using the clone tool. There just is no option over here to make it a live clone. So we'll get rid of this sculpture and we'll look at paint mode really quickly. Just grab a brighter pink color that's easy to see, and since I was using the stamp tool last time, I'll use the brush tool this time. Sort of make a little swirly shape. Scope out of here. Now with painting, there's no detail reduction tool with painting the way that there is in sculptures. So you kind of have to plan ahead a little bit more with regards to the thermometer, if the thermometer is becoming a concern for you. If we clone this a whole bunch of times, it's pretty much the same thing as it is with a sculpture, where, each of these is a unique object, and so it's adding to the gameplay thermometer, but they're simple, and so the graphics thermometer is staying pretty low. And then if we go scope in here, we can do the same thing of cloning it within the... We can do the same thing of cloning it while we're scoped into the painting, instead of while we're scoped out of the painting. And if we come out of here, now we have a more complex painting. We talked about merging just a little bit. If we make several clones of this painting, we now have the option to merge those. Doing that is a little bit helpful for the gameplay thermometer. It's also very hard on the graphics thermometer at this point to merge this cluster of paintings. If we do that, we won't see an increase here because this is such a small painting. But I did some interesting tests, and it goes up really, really quickly. And so I'm going to talk in the next segment of the tutorial a little bit about some new unique options that paintings have that's an alternative to cloning. If we get scoped back in here, so I did some tests on what happens to the thermometer when you merge a bunch of cloned paintings, and I'll show those percentages here. This is 3 brush strokes all in one painting, and that's what it took to get up to 2% on the graphics thermometer. The reason that 2% is my benchmark, because as soon as you put down one fleck of paint is probably actually like 0.01%, but it registers as a whole percent. And so when I'm doing these tests, I just see how much painting I can do before the thermometer ticks over from 1% to 2%. And these are doing 3 full strokes, and full stroke means putting down as much paint as you can put down in one gesture, just squeezing the button and scribbling until you run out of paint. And it does stop you at a certain point. We'll just go in and look at this really quickly. If I get up close, you can see by the size of my imp, and you can see the scale. This is default brush stroke size. That's how much you get on one. You could call it an ink pot if you're going with Okami terms. Then you have to start a new brush stroke. So there's a limit to the size of one individual brush stroke, which is one of these things. And each of these is a unique brush stroke. So the 3 of these add up to being a whole percent on the thermometer. Might be good to mention also this little icon that's popping up here. This is just letting me know, reminding me that I'm offline, that I'm not connected to the internet right now. The only significance of that is that I can't publish or save anything online, and that's because beta has actually ended. So this one painting that takes up 2% of the graphics, I cloned it 12 times. 12 is how many times I was able to clone it before the 2% on the graphics went up to 3%. So that represents a 1% increase by cloning this one painting 12 times over. I took that clone, those 12 clones of the painting, and merged them. I couldn't merge them all into one because there's a limit to how much paint can be merged at once. So I had to merge it in 3 sections of 4, which is not even as much of an increase as the graphics thermometer would have if you could merge it into one, but just doing that, it went up to 13%. And that's just for merging these cloned brush strokes. So the point that I'm getting to is that you shouldn't merge your paintings unless you have a good reason to. And there is sometimes a good reason, which we'll get to in another segment, and that is the duplicates tweak. Next we'll have painting frame-by-frame animations.